Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. And today we are broadcasting in the home of our friends Jim Vrettos and B.D. Cohan in the what I like to call the liberal Upper West Side. We are a show that is trying to create dialogue and connection and conversation and feature critical ideas of our time that are being left out of the mainstream media. So we're trying to do that. We're trying to get back into salons and human conversation and connection. And we like to feature people who really, I think, you ought to hear more about. And one of them is an economist named Rick Wolff. And we're so happy, we're so honored to have him as our special guest today. Rick is an economist who has been going around the country with his message that the workplace has to be democratized. His latest book is called Democracy at Work. And he's been on the Charlie Rose Show, he's been on Bill Moyers, and he's a professor at the New School down in the Village. And we're just so pleased to have him on the show. Rick is going to give a discourse, and he's going to talk a little bit about what's happening in his life and his work and where his concerns are with where the economy is headed. And then Jim, who is a sociologist and a criminologist at John Jay College and also the host of a radio show called The Rebbe, The Radical, and The Rev, is going to give his reaction and questions, and then it's going to come back to me, and we're going to have a dialogue, and we're going to discover things, and we're going to try to enrich the public airwaves with some ideas and articulation that is quite absent, we think, these days. So without further ado, I will pass the microphone, which is also like a talking stick, over to economist Rick Wolff.
Thank you, John. That's a very generous introduction, and I'll try to live up to it. As a professional economist, my job has been for the last 40 years to teach economics in American universities and to keep abreast of what's going on to the economic system, capitalism, that we live in. And this moment of talking with you is also a moment when everything I've learned, everything I've observed, and indeed, the same is true of most of my colleagues, left-wingers, right-wingers, and those in the middle. And so let me start with what we all agree on and then go into the areas where we don't agree so much. Here's what we agree on. The American economy is in the worst shape it has ever been in our lifetimes. And as you can tell from the color of my hair, that's a long time. The prospects are grim. The reality is grimmer still. And while we don't agree as economists on why that's the case, and we don't agree on what needs to be done about it, we do not disagree about the assessment of where we are. So I want to talk a little bit about that and what it means and what it portends for us. So let's begin. Capitalism, which has been around in Western societies for 300 years and has now gone global in the sense that particularly over the last 50 to 100 years it has spread all over the world, is now a system that has to be judged, as all systems do, with its results. What has 300 years of capitalism given the world? And I think we mostly know the good news here, and there's plenty of that. The wealth that has been produced by human effort has increased very impressively. The technological advances that capitalism has accomplished are impressive by any standard, by any measure. We have a unified world. We can get anywhere in the world in a matter of hours. We can communicate anywhere in the world in a matter of seconds. It's astonishing and it's impressive, and capitalism deserves the credit or at least part of the credit, for having made such achievements. Length of life is longer, the percentage of babies that survive their first year is greater than it was in previous periods of time, and those are also achievements that at least partly are the result of capitalism. And for those reasons, capitalism is still widely celebrated, widely appreciated, and widely institutionalized. But now we have to turn also to the other side of the ledger, because if we stopped at this point, it wouldn't be an analysis, it would be a lopsided celebration. And those things are not the same. So let's look at the other side of the ledger. And the reason I want to talk about the other side is it's the side that's becoming more and more important in people's minds, in people's daily lives, and in their attitudes about what has to happen in this society in the immediate future. So let's begin. The history of capitalism is also the history of producing inequalities in wealth and well-being that have no parallel unless you go back to the age of the pharaohs. We now have a couple of thousand billionaires around the world living at standards of living that literally rival the pharaoh and are often modeled on the pharaohs or other extravagant, wealthy folks. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have an unspeakable mass of poverty. And that, too, has to be laid at capitalism. It has widened the gap between rich and poor beyond anything seen in the world in the past, even including the pharaohs. We have a situation, just to give you a few examples, of people spending $50 to $100 million to buy a penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue, at the same time that the United Nations a few weeks ago made as one of its major projects in 2014 a campaign for toilets. And let me explain what I mean. Somewhere on the order of 2 billion people around the world, that's a major portion of the world, do not have running water external toilets. And as a result, they suffer countless diseases that would not be a problem if they had that. It tells you something about how a society develops. If something on the order of a quarter or a third of the world's population has no toilet, whereas other people are living, as I said, spectacular lives of grotesque and out of proportion wealth. To bring it even closer to home, the history of capitalism is a history in which those who have are in the best position to gain more, and those who don't have are in the worst position to gain more. That's why inequality is built into and endemic to this kind of an economic system. Periodically, those who gather the wealth into their own hands are forced to share it. In other words, the wealth that accumulates in the hands of the employers and the wealthy in society has to be shared to some extent by them with the mass of people. When that happens, it becomes possible to persuade the mass of people that they should support and sustain capitalism, even though it disproportionately enriches a tiny percentage. This is particularly difficult in societies that take seriously democracy, or the idea that everybody votes and makes political decisions, because an economic system that enriches a small minority cannot coexist very long with a political system that empowers the majority. And the reason for that isn't complicated. Sooner or later, if the majority of people are not rewarded by the economic system, and a tiny minority are, the majority will understand that they have the political power as a majority. If voting and democracy exist, they have the political chance, the power, to undo the consequences and results of an economic system they don't like. to make a very long story short, the vote is a way for the mass of people to undo the inequality that capitalism cannot help itself but to produce. And that happens periodically. In the United States, it happened in the 1930s. The Great Depression, the worst collapse of capitalism until the one we're in now, and we'll see whether this one is less severe, which it has been so far, than the 1930s, or ends up being more severe. The jury has to be out on that, because we're not out of this one yet. But at least, going back to the Great Depression, we can see something very interesting. Millions of people lost their job, just like today. Production was crippled for years, just like today. People lost their homes by the millions, just like today, and so on. But here's something that happened in the 30s that has not happened over the last 6 years of this crisis, and we'll see whether it happens. We don't know yet. But here's something we know happened in the 1930s. A movement from below arose of such size and of such power that the folks at the top had to part with the wealth they had accumulated, very simply and briefly. A union movement developed in the United States called the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations, which swept the United States in the 1930s, signing up millions of Americans who had never been in a trade union before. And the union drive was partnered with a Communist Party and two Socialist parties in the United States who were strong at that time. A little detail of American history that most courses in American history seem to not focus much on. And the partnership of the CIO, the two Socialist parties, and the Communist Party generated a massive pressure from below, organized, disciplined, and representing tens of millions of Americans. They went to talk with the President of the United States, a center-of-the-road Democrat, rather similar in many ways to a Clinton or an Obama or that, by the name Roosevelt. And they basically said to Mr. Roosevelt, you've got to do something for the mass of people suffering through this depression. You have to. Because if you don't, we are not going to support you politically. And that's the labor movement part. Over there, you see those socialists and communists? They have an even further idea, which is if you don't do something for the mass of people, they're going to get rid of this whole capitalist system just like they did over there in Russia. Mr. Roosevelt was an astute politician, and he understood that they had the tens of millions to make good on these threats. So Mr. Roosevelt did an interesting thing. He went to talk to his friends, wealthy property owners like his own family, and heads of corporations. People he came from because that's who he was, as most presidents either have been or have become as a result of being president. And he basically told them the same story. He said, I need you to give me the money. There is no money to take care of masses of people. That's what a depression means. Everybody's out of a job. Nobody can pay taxes, so the government has no money. There's nothing to, just like we hear today in the United States, we have to cut back on Social Security, and we have to cut back on schools and the food stamp program and all the rest. Well, it was much worse then. The unemployment much higher then, so nobody had any money. Except, of course, the wealthy, who had all the money, just as they do today. And Roosevelt went to them and he said, look, you have to give me the money to take care of the mass of people. I have to do something for them, because if we don't do something for them, we're not going to have any money at all. So let's be smart. Let's part with some of what we have, spread it around to the mass of people, help them, and therefore they'll support us, and I'll be able to get them to stop talking about revolution or socialism or anything else. Half of the business and wealthy people were never persuaded. They didn't buy the argument. They thought that those people could never make good on their threats, and if they did, well, there were the police and the army. But half of them understood that a society sustained by the police and the army is not what they wanted and had its own dangers. So half of them went with Roosevelt. And so Roosevelt did it. He taxed wealthy people and the rich. Let me say that again so your audience doesn't miss it. He taxed corporations and the rich heavily, and they agreed to it. I will give you just two examples. The top income tax bracket was raised in the 1930s from around 20% to around 90%. That's a tax increase on the rich. The corporate tax was raised. Tax on business, tax on the rich. That brought in their money, a lot of it. What did Roosevelt do? Number one, he created the Social Security system. We never had that before. Suddenly the government would give every working person age 65 and older a check every month for the rest of his and her life. In the midst of a depression where we had been told there's no money to do anything, something of extraordinary costliness was done. That it wasn't to bail out a bank, and it wasn't to help a wealthy person. It was to help everybody 65 years of age. Every working class family suddenly got help taking care of the elderly financially that they had never had before. When that was done, he declared, I'm going to start the unemployment compensation system. We had never had that before in America either. If you're unemployed through no fault of your own, the government will give you a check every week for a couple of years to help you out. This is done at a time when there were tens of millions of unemployed people. Therefore, a staggeringly expensive program paid for by taxes on corporations and the rich. And when he was finished with that, he declared one more big program. He said, if the private capitalist sector of our economy, by far the bulk of it, is either unable or unwilling to provide work for the millions of Americans who want to work, then there's no alternative but for the government to do it, and I'm going to do it, and Roosevelt did it. Between 1934 and 1941, he created and filled roughly 15 million jobs. And what paid the salaries of these workers? Taxes on corporations and the rich. And guess what? In the 1930s, the inequality in the United States was drastically and quickly reduced by the political power of masses of people organized from below. Over the last 50 years, all of that has been slowly and steadily undone. The business and the corporate communities, outraged by what had happened, unable to stop it because Roosevelt had the masses of people on his side and half the rich went along with it. Let's remember that Roosevelt became unspeakably powerful, the only president in the United States to be reelected 4 times. No president had ever done that. Let me underscore that. The president who taxed the rich and the corporations to help the masses of people didn't suffer politically because of it. He gained politically beyond anything any other president has ever been able to do. The Republicans were so freaked out by what he had been able to do, that one of the first things they did right after he died was to pass an amendment so that no president could hold office for more than 2 terms consecutively. Okay. After the war, after Roosevelt is dead, when the threat of the Soviet Union seemed manageable, especially with a military buildup by the United States, the work could begin to undo. The corporations and the rich could work to undo. And we've been seeing that for the last 50 years. So where are we in 2014? Well, we're back to a capitalism without a massive interference by the government pressured from below. And boy, do we see the results. Gross inequality rearing its head and proceeding at an incredible pace. The disappearance of the so-called middle class as corporations decide that even with their power here in the United States, they can make much more money producing in China and India and Brazil, and they've been leaving the United States and leaving American cities destroyed. Detroit, Cleveland, Camden, we all know the story, or we should. Masses of Americans either unable to get any work or having to accept jobs at incomes way below what their educations or their expectations had led them to believe would be their livelihoods. Everywhere the word is out, the middle class is disappearing, the middle class is going. So here's my conclusion. Capitalism has shown itself to be a system that produces extraordinary inequality as its normal way of functioning. It has also proven to the mass of people that the only way to stop that is to make an enormous organized political pressure from below. Last part of my story. In the aftermath of World War II, the corporations and the rich didn't only undo what had been accomplished in the 1930s, but they were smart. They knew to make it last, they didn't just have to undo the law, get rid of the Social Security or weaken it. They had to undo the political organizations that made it possible. So in the aftermath of the war, first, destroy the Communist Party by transforming it from an agency fighting for the mass of people into an agent of a foreign power, and therefore treasonous. So you got rid of that. As soon as that was done, you went across America to persuade everyone that socialism and communism are just different ways of spelling the same thing, and therefore you should get rid of them. So you got rid of them, and when that was done, you went to work to destroy the labor movement, which has been shrinking without interruption for 50 years. Today, the unions represent less than 7% of all workers in the private sector, the major part of our society. So they've destroyed the institutions that they knew had come together to force mass well-being onto the folks who run this capitalist system. All those institutions are either gone or weakened. They're not in a position to make that happen. So capitalism has a free rein to go forward and do its utmost to maximize profits, to concentrate wealth at the top. And the current crisis we're in is the end result of that process. Nor is there any social force available to undo it. This puts us now in the most dangerous political and economic situation of my lifetime. A society that is suffering the destruction of its economic hopes and dreams. The first generation of college students graduating with more debts than the job prospects they have will ever allow them to repay. I mean, it's staggering when you look around it, what's going on. And this is a population that wasn't prepared for this, has no preparation for it, has very few savings to fall back on to see it through this situation, and a dominant capitalist class hell-bent to move forward, to brook no interference. This is a society heading towards cataclysmic internal ruptures. And it is only the power of denial, not seeing this history, not understanding its implications, not seeing where things are going. Capitalists themselves see. They're leaving. They're moving their production out of this country to India and China and Brazil as fast as they can. They're focusing their marketing plans there because that's where economic growth is. They see in Detroit and Cleveland and Camden the foretaste of what's coming to many other cities. Where wealthy people can, they enclose themselves in gated communities, in little segregated islands, where they can protect themselves for what they suspect is coming. You have to be blind, deaf, and very dumb not to understand that we have transitioned from an economy that was required to share the wealth to an economy which is telling more and more people with each passing day, there's little or nothing for you. You have a college degree, work at Starbucks. You have a home that you can't quite cover the mortgage, learn the joys of rental. You know, it's everywhere the same. And at a certain point, as it dawns on Americans, there's going to be pushback. Occupy Wall Street was simply the first of what's coming. And whether it comes from a disgruntled right wing in the Tea Party or an angry left wing relearning the lessons of the 1930s, the prospects in this society are for profound social division and the conflicts that always follow from that. That's the negative legacy of capitalism, but it is increasingly dominating consciousness and politics way more than that positive part of the story, which is receding from what's uppermost on the minds of most Americans.
Thank you, Professor Wolff, for this incredible analysis, so deep and prescient and comprehensive. This is a great moment for us and our television program that we get to broadcast this out. We're wired to 1 million homes in Manhattan. We're also broadcasting in Hudson County, New Jersey, in towns like Hoboken, where they have a mayor who recently stood up to a bully Republican governor by the name of Chris Christie, and she outed one of those scandals that's unfolding. We're also being broadcast in Union City and towns like that have a mostly poor working class Latino population. So I'm really grateful that folks who are not familiar with your analysis will get a chance to see this. And I also hope that the Nobel Prize Committee that gives out the Nobel Prize for economics is watching, because I saw your rival, Mr. Krugman, on the Sunday morning program today, and they're just discussing Hillary Clinton and how much money she can make for the campaign and things like this that don't seem to really be to matter. But I want to pass the microphone over to Jim Vrettos, who is a sociologist at John Jay College and also the host of a radio show called The Rebbe, The Radical, and The Rev, for his reflections on Rick's talk. And then I have some more things to say later, and then we'll give the microphone back to Rick.
Great. Thank you, John, and thank you, Rick. I'm not the Rebbe and I'm not the Rev, so I guess I will be the radical for us here. Well, listen, that grim analysis certainly has to be seconded by the parallels and links I see in my field, criminology and the criminal justice system, parallel to the struggles of the Great Society, some of the New Left movements in the 60s. We had a response and reaction to that in the late 60s with the Nixon administration. And really the beginnings of the war, the more recent attacks on the poor and people of color through the war on crime, and of course followed rapidly with the war on drugs in the early 70s. So we've gone from a population, a prison population of a few 100,000 to one now of close to 2.5 million. Millions of others have been through that system and are now part of what we refer to as the prison industrial complex, but a re-entry industry, which again has kept millions and millions of people dependent on this system. People come out of prison, 70% of them return again. The recidivism rate is absolutely astronomical. This should not be a surprise, because prison itself as an invention starts in America. It's an American capitalistic invention in a sense. The idea of taking someone's freedom away from them and punishing them by putting them in a cage gets started in the early 1800s by the Quakers, a so-called progressive Christian group who saw themselves in acting in a humane way to improve on the capital and corporal punishment that was usually the punishment of the day. So we've got to grapple with these patterns that are endemic within the system. We've got to see that they've caused unspeakable damage to millions and millions of people, and we've got to talk about, well, what's next? How do we stem the tide from this incredibly grim economic analysis, and how it plays itself out so much in the criminal justice system? I mean, in New York City here, you all know, under the Bloomberg administration, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young people, mainly, of course, young people of color in selected communities. 7 police precincts in this city produce 70% of all the state inmates in New York State. So we see that the decks are stacked against the poor, and have always been, for that matter, in this society. Whether white ethnics, African Americans, Hispanics, it's always been disproportionately the poor who have been the products of the criminal justice system and the prison system and the parole and probation system. When we look at the figures, we see that it also directly parallels some of the economic figures that you've been talking about, Rick. Poverty rates began to go down somewhat in the 60s as a result of some of the war on poverty programs. One program itself started under my mentor, Richard Cloward, Mobilization for Youth. These programs did have an effect. We went from a 19.1% poverty rate to something like a 13.9 or 13.7% by the end of that decade. But that began to shift dramatically as the war on crime, as the resources went away from those social programs and on into the criminal justice system. Right? So it was the imprisonment of people, it was the resources being put and given more and more to the police, to the quasi-military institutions that were mainly there to control the disimpoverished groups that were most threatening or could most threaten the capitalistic system. So I personally got involved in a demonstration, a protest, a court case a couple of years ago that began to change the narrative on stop and frisk. We got arrested protesting that policy in New York City. More and more of the narrative began to change. So today we have a new administration that is beginning to look at how they could modify and reform that system, make it more transparent and so on and so on. That doesn't mean it's going to end. So we'll probably have a system where the same people, it'll be the same old, the same people will be in some way punished or controlled, maybe a little more kindly, but certainly these are the threatening groups of the population we need to still control. So ending stop and frisk is not the major goal of the new administration. It's still about controlling them in different ways. Remains to be seen how that all plays itself out. Mass incarceration keeps going up and up. So what we need to do is look at not reforming the system, but transforming it in a structural way, ending mass incarceration, ending stop and frisk. And as Rick was pointing out, I think the best and perhaps only hope is to mobilize and organize those disadvantaged groups themselves. And one of the things I'm doing with a colleague at John Jay, Doug Tompkins, and I, we are beginning to organize the families of the formerly incarcerated. Formerly incarcerated and the families of families of the formerly incarcerated, who as a block of people make up well over 1 million people in this city. That's more than all the labor unions put together. So this is a potentially valuable source of power that needs to be heard. So through this and other mobilizing and organizing of various groups of disenfranchised people, I hope that we can begin to turn around this incredibly grim analysis that Rick has had, and that I certainly agree with. The system is broken, can't be reformed, so we need to talk about how we can really start and imagine something new.
Imagine, as John Lennon sang the song, imagine all the people living life in peace. And there's also a new book called Imagine Living in a Socialist USA, which was published by a corporate publisher, by the way. It's very surprising. So maybe there is a shift going on, and thinking also, Jim, about all these poor folks who are in prison. I'm teaching now at Essex County College in Newark, New Jersey, one of those impoverished cities, and it's just really apparent to me that the education system has really is doing more to dumb people down now than to educate, because my students have a very little analysis of what's going on in the economy, in the world. They don't even know what the left is or the right is. They come out of a school system after 12 years of schooling, they come into my classes, and most of them hate to read and hate to write. So what's going on in those schools? And I'm wondering if there's a connection here. One of the things I love to hear, Rick, your analysis whenever you give lectures, recently at the Upper East Side Church, the Universalist Church there, and also at the Breck Forum. I've heard you speaking at the Left Forum, is that I could take that analysis back to my students. Because it's one thing to hear your message, Rick, and I think it's so important what you have to say, but then we get caught up in the everyday life, and we start reading the paper, and we get immersed in mainstream media, and we sort of forget all of that. So what I would like to know is, going forward, is how do we fix these problems? How do we solve these problems? What will be the political aspect? I know one of the things that you did, Rick, was you ran for mayor in Connecticut, in a town in Connecticut. What town was that again? New Haven, Connecticut. Now, we just saw a socialist councilwoman elected in Seattle, a major American city. So how do we not be cynical? How do we stay hopeful, and what are some of the steps we can take to move forward?
Well, one of the most powerful organizations of masses of people in the United States are what are called the 12-step programs. And of course, the original one of those was Alcoholics Anonymous. And one of the things that Alcoholics Anonymous teaches is that the first thing a person has to be able to say, who becomes part of that process, is to admit that they're an alcoholic. Because if you don't face the grim reality that oppresses you, then you have no chance of getting out of it. And so the good news is that to face a difficult or grim reality, but to face it honestly, can be the first step to escaping it, to curing it, to going beyond it. So I don't present grim analyses of the economy because I enjoy grimness. I want the same result. I want us to say, look, the good news is if we understand it and see it and face it and stop denying it, then we can begin to do something about it. So let me give two examples. And I'll begin with Jim Vrettos' discussion of prisons. The prison in our society, looked at economically, is an absurd, irrational institution. And let me go through why. If we have 2.5 million people in jail, and if, as the research, if I understand it correctly, tells us that it costs somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 per person per year to incarcerate somebody, more in city jails, less in other instances, but on an average, 30 to 40,000. We're talking many, many, many billions of dollars a year to do this. That money is coming from taxpayers who would rather do other things with that money than pay to produce horrible buildings in which we destroy human beings. And when I say destroy human beings, let's remember, with a recidivism rate of 70%, we're saying that most of the people we put into jails are so further damaged by being in that institution that they're less able to function outside than they were when they went in. This is an institution that is therefore costing us many billions of tax dollars and making the problem worse, not better. Any rational human being would say, wait a minute, stop, this isn't working. What would it take to provide a decent job and a decent income to all those people? Well, again, for $40,000 a year, you could put all these imprisoned people to work, give them a decent job, pay them not a generous but an adequate salary to begin a reasonable life. And here's the difference. You wouldn't be using that money to render them unproductive, sitting in an isolation cell year after year. You'd be paying them a salary to produce something useful in the community. Improve the national park, help take care of the elderly, provide more personnel in schools, improve our infrastructure. The thousands of things we all can list that need to be done. And they would be paid a reasonable salary for a reasonable number of hours. They could hold a job, feel good about the job, be able to function in the community, hold their heads up high. It would be spectacular therapy for them. It would be good for the society. It's all demonstration of the fundamental irrationality and dysfunctionality of a society that puts 2.5 million people in an institution costing taxpayers thousands and thousands, trillions of dollars if you add it up over the years. It's lunacy. And it's obvious how to do better than this with a proper jobs program. My second and bigger example. If one of the fundamental dysfunctional qualities of capitalism is the inequality it constantly uses and reproduces on a global scale for the last 300 years, dramatically here in the United States over the last 35 years as the exceptionalism of the 1930s upsurge fades historically out of the picture, then here's a proposal that could deal with that problem. Suppose we change the way we organize enterprises. And let me explain what I mean. It's really simple. We democratize them. We say that our commitment as a nation to democracy, to the notion that if people are affected by a decision, they have therefore the right to participate in making it. If that's true, then it ought to apply in the workplace, because that's where adults spend most of their lives. 5 out of 7 days, once you're an adult, you go to work. You get up to prepare for work, then you go to the work, then you do the work, then you recoup your energies from the work in order to do it again the next day. Workplace is where we focus our adult lives. Any society whose commitment to democracy is genuine would have had to institute it in the workplace first and foremost. But we live in a society that has never subjected the workplace to democratization. When you go to work, you walk in the door of an institution in which a tiny group of people, major shareholders, who select a board of directors, 50 to 20 people, they make all the decisions. They decide what you will produce, how you will produce it, where you will produce it, and when you're done, they take the fruits of your labor, the goods and services you helped to produce, and they decide what to do with them, who to sell them to, what the price is, and they take the profits, and they decide what to do with those. You live with the results. Those people can decide to close the factory and move it to China. Those people can decide to take the net revenues or profits and give themselves spectacular salaries and dividends. You will live with low incomes, or you will live with no job at all. These are decisions that affect your lives, and your participation in them, zero, nil. Suppose we change that. Suppose we say we're going to have all the people in every workplace, in every store, in every office, in every factory, together decide the basic decisions. Now let's see, you and I together in 5 minutes, what the results would be. Example 1. Shall we close the business here and move instead to China? The board of directors says yes, because we can hire cheap workers there. The collective of democratic workers says absolutely not.
Stay in New York.
We live here,
can-
we work here, our children and our families are here, our neighbors and our friends. We're not leaving. We'll find another solution, but we're not leaving. Wow. The exodus of high-paying jobs from America for 40 years and the substitution of low-paying jobs would never have happened. Here's a second example. When it comes time to deciding what to do with the profits, I want to remind you that everybody helps to produce, from the guy who sweeps the floor, to the woman who keeps the records, to the man who works at the machine, to the woman who designs the graphics, whatever the works are, they all help to produce it. Suppose they all decided democratically what to do with the profits they all helped to produce. You think they'd give a few top executives tens of millions of dollars in pay packages while the average worker can't pay for their college education for their kid? Not a chance. The single most important cause of inequality in capitalism is the distribution of the profits made by every enterprise. If that distribution were democratized, that would be the end of the system's tendency towards inequality. If you want to do something about the problems of the society, that's what we need to understand. Democratize the enterprise and confront the other irrationalities like mass incarcerations that flow from all of this. This is a system problem. It's not going to be solved by punishing a few corporate executives. It's not going to be solved by another law, another regulation. Those are details. We have here a system that has delivered good things, but it isn't doing much of that anymore. Now it's not delivering the goods, it's mostly delivering the bads. And that's when a system has come to the end of its useful life. About capitalism, I would say the following. It's like that time your refrigerator stopped working for the umpteenth time, and you called the repairman or woman, and he or she said to you, look, I can fix it again. I can do it. It'll cost you $82. But I'm telling you, I'll be back here within a few months, and it'll cost you another $300. Stop. It's time you changed to a new refrigerator. We're at that point with our economic system.
No, absolutely, Rick. Agree with you all, with everything you said there. However, you gave that analogy there with Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, these spontaneous self-help healing groups. Great groups. However, only about 20 or 30% of alcoholics ever get to the point where they're beginning to admit they've got the problem. And we're still in a great state of denial here. We're still perpetuating this myth of the American dream. So
imagine.
I'm imagining.
All the victims of
I know.
capitalism, if 20%
That's
of
right.
them were able to understand what was happening to them and admit it, oh boy, then we would have the same kind of movement that they had in the 1930s.
Well spoken, and I agree with that. So we do have that enough people out there who realize that it's broken. We need to get out of our state of denial. We need to start being much more rational about how we're running this system. But again, we've got to go and understand the scapegoat role that the system plays. I know I've had Carl Hart on my show, and he's going to be at the Left Forum too, the Columbia University drug researcher whose book High Price points out again, the drug war is a war that enables us to not do and not deal with the problems that lead people to drugs in the first place. All right, it's a convenient scapegoat. So we've got to get to that level where we begin to realize that, and certainly the narrative we're having today, I think, will enable us to begin to get into that, and that's so important. So I agree with you that we've got a group of people that are ready to take the stand on that.
I just feel like I'm basking here. I'm basking in ideas and in intelligence and analysis that you just rarely get from mainstream media. I'm wondering, where do we go from here? I'm just thinking, I wish Nobel Prize Committee, I do hope you're watching. in terms of the political structure, should we think about starting a new party? Should we think about the Democrats, can they be reformed? Can they be moved to the left? Should we have citizen groups that meet together on a regular basis to discuss these things? What are some practical solutions for how do we go forward, and how do we get the knowledge that you just articulated to our audience? And I hope, audience members, you'll share this with other people and keep thinking about these ideas and thinking about how we can get a better system and not just go back into that old election cycle, twiddly-dee, twiddly-dum, Democrats, Republicans. Yeah.
Well, I think for me, there's no question we have to build new organizations. Gather people together who work, who divide the labor among themselves and the tasks in order to create a functioning institution. We know, most of us, of at least some examples of functioning institutions, whether it's the family where the work gets divided up between mom and pop and children's and grandparents and all the rest, or whether it's a local club that has to have a coordination among people to survive, or a local church, or we actually know what it means to get people together to produce an institution that benefits us, that means something to us. And the political changes we need, they require that kind of an institution because it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, it takes coordination, it takes building support. But we have to face the fact that the institutions that used to do that were destroyed after World War II. No accident. I've talked about that. They were destroyed because they were so effective in the 1930s. And we have to be open now to doing all the things you said. Work with the Democratic Party, why not? Long shot for sure, but why not? Why not try everything else? Why not get together with a few people and even do something that's a little crazy, like set up a bunch of tents in Zuccotti Park and imagine that people will find meaning in that. Look, if they had asked me before that, I would have advised them that that wouldn't likely work. And my advice would have been wrong. They would have been right, and look what they did. They taught Americans that there are millions of people out there who agree to this. They taught Americans that you can get the sympathy of most Americans for what you're saying if you do it in a certain way. Those are the experiments that have to now be made, lots of them, so that we can learn what the ways are to create and sustain and build the organizations that have to happen for us to once again break into capitalism's own way. Because if we don't, this system will ironically keep going. And it is a system that is a train heading into a stone wall. That's why we collapsed in 2007, and that's where a renewal of this economic system will take us again.
We're moving towards final reflections on this amazing conversation. I feel so grateful to be a part of it. I think it's a great moment for our television show, for our project, that we have someone like a Rick Wolff as our guest to give this kind of amazing analysis and depth of the complex issues that we're facing, and to really put it in a way that's easy to understand. I understand, Rick, you've been going around and speaking in front of people who are very enthusiastic about this. I don't know if you've ever thought about running for office, but I know we need you doing what you're doing, but just a thought to throw it out there. But Claudia, how much time do we have left? We have 4 minutes left. I'm going to pass the microphone over to Jim, and if he has any other reflections. Also, we had discussed earlier, Jim and I, about how we could be more effective in using these kind of salons and bringing people together. Maybe a Rick Wolff tour of the living rooms of America, or this sort of a thing where we gather people for discussion and dialogue.
Absolutely. This is one of the forums that needs to be developed and expanded on, so people can see the alternatives and talk about the alternatives and get together and discuss these things. Briefly, in terms of my own field, I think it's change has to come from the disenfranchised themselves and the academics and the activists that would support them on this. So that's why I'm focusing on the demonstrations, the protests, that lead to a new narrative on the stop and frisk program to end mass incarceration, to see the dependency on the parole, probation system. We need to mobilize the families of the formerly incarcerated into a movement whereby their viewpoints are being heard. Sort of this Saul Alinsky model, empowering those who are powerless and getting their voice out there. I think this is where change has to occur. But I agree with Rick and also John that we need to really use as many of these levers of poking at the system as possible.
I want to pass it to Rick just for final thoughts, but also wanted to say that I'm educating within the business world. I created an organization called the Ethical Business Society to raise consciousness behind the Iron Curtain of corporate America and get the good people there to learn about these things that are going on. And what are your final thoughts on this, Rick? And also, I always like to say, what would it take to get a media of this out to the kind of audience that a CNBC gets too, right? But what are your final reflections on our discussion today?
Not the least sign of change and hope is the fact that, at least for me, and I'm not the only one, the opportunities, even in mainstream media, are now enormously greater than they were even as little as 2 or 3 years ago. And
You were on Charlie Rose.
yes, and Bill Moyers and more is coming. That I can't tell you, but you'll see it soon enough.
Did you get a reaction to being on Charlie Rose? Did people?
Yes, I got thousands of emails. Bill Moyers, the reaction was so positive in February of last year. He brought me back in March of last year. No, the interest and the support in the American people is much, much greater than is normally understood. And even the mass media who try to respond for their own reasons to what the mass of people are interested in are discovering that this is part of that. And there are openings there, and everybody in 100 ways, large and small, should pursue them. Let me leave you with a final thought. Up until recently, the left in America felt beleaguered, attacked, paranoid, often for good reason, and having no place to work, no opening in the public mind. Over the last 4 years, the trials and tribulations of capitalism themselves have made this system break down and teach the mass of people that it's breaking down. Consequently, it is itself generating the audience for its critics. The opportunity for us now is greater than it's been, and that's a very positive thing because we're the ones who are going to help provoke the understanding and the change that can make a difference and do better for this society than it's now doing for itself.
Thank you for spending time with us today on the Public Voice Salon, Rick.
My pleasure.
Keep up your good work. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jim. Yes.
Open love.
Open love, yes.
Open
yes.
love.
Okay.